When we bought the house on Marrow Lane, I convinced myself that the unease I felt was just first-night anxiety. The place was old, older than anything we had ever lived in, with tall narrow windows and wood that creaked even without pressure. The paint peeled in thin strips along the porch railing, and the front door stuck slightly when pushed open, as though reluctant to allow us inside. Lena tried to fill the silence with optimism, talking about renovations and fresh starts. Caleb ran up the staircase laughing, claiming the upstairs would be his kingdom. But even in those first few hours, I felt it, a density in the air, something thick and unmoving, like the house had lungs but refused to breathe. That first night, long after my wife and son fell asleep, I stared into the dark hallway outside our bedroom and felt certain that if I blinked too long, I would see someone standing there. The second night, the house began to make itself known. Around 2 in the morning, slow footsteps moved across the ceiling directly above our bed. They weren't random creaks or settling wood. They were rhythmic. Intentional. Heel to toe. Heel to toe. Lena whispered that it was just an old structure adjusting to temperature changes, but the sound carried weight, as though someone was pacing thoughtfully. Caleb complained the next morning that he didn't sleep well. He said someone had been whispering in his room, too quiet to understand but close enough to feel breath on his face. I checked the attic that afternoon, pushing aside insulation and dust. It was empty. No animals. No loose boards. Nothing that could explain the pacing. A few days later, we discovered the cold room. It was at the end of the upstairs hallway, slightly smaller than the others. No matter how high we turned the heat, that room remained unnaturally cold. The air inside felt damp and stale, and even sunlight from the window failed to warm it. Caleb refused to enter after one evening when he stood in the doorway and froze. He told us there was a man in the corner. A tall man. He said the man didn't have eyes. Lena brushed it off as imagination, but she never stepped fully inside that room again. When I finally entered alone, closing the door behind me, the temperature seemed to drop further. The silence inside was oppressive. Then I heard it, a faint scratching from inside the walls, slow and patient, as if something was testing the boundaries from within. That was when I decided to seek help. Our nearest church was small and quiet, led by Father Dorian, a reserved priest with tired but gentle eyes. After Sunday service, I approached him and explained that the house felt wrong. I didn't mention the whispers or the eyeless man. I only said that something in the house felt hostile. When I gave him the address, he grew very still. The color drained subtly from his face. He repeated, Marrow Lane, as though tasting something bitter. Still, he agreed to visit later that week. When Father Dorian arrived, dusk had already begun to settle. The sky was gray and low. He stepped out of his car slowly, staring at the house longer than necessary. The moment he crossed the threshold into our entryway, he stopped. He didn't even make it 3 steps inside. His eyes lifted toward the staircase, then toward the hallway. His hand tightened around the crucifix he carried. And then, without explanation, he stepped backward out of the house. He told us quietly that he could not bless this place. Not would not, could not. His voice trembled slightly as he urged us to leave immediately. When I demanded to know why, he simply said, some things are not meant to be disturbed again. That night, anger overpowered fear. I climbed into the attic again, determined to prove there was nothing supernatural about our home. As I pushed aside insulation near one of the beams, I found something carved deep into the wood, a twisted circular symbol intersected with jagged lines. It wasn't accidental. It had been carved with force and purpose. The wood around it felt strangely warm against my fingers. As I leaned closer to inspect it, the attic door slammed shut below me. The temperature dropped sharply, and in the silence, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. Caleb began talking about the quiet man more frequently. He said the man stood in the upper corner of his room at night, smiling without eyes. One evening, I stood outside Caleb's door and listened. I heard Caleb whispering as though responding to someone. A second voice, lower and slower, answered him, too faint to understand but undeniably present. When I rushed inside, the room was empty except for Caleb sitting upright in bed. His window, which I had nailed shut days earlier, was wide open. I returned to Father Dorian, demanding answers. This time, he told me the history of the house. It had once belonged to a man named Silas Marrow, rumored to have performed rituals in an attempt to bind something ancient to the land itself. When Marrow disappeared, the house remained. Every attempt to bless it had failed. Some priests refused to enter at all. Father Dorian told me plainly that the house did not need cleansing. It needed to be abandoned. The house grew worse after that. The walls began to produce a sound like breathing, a low inhale followed by a drawn-out exhale. Lena heard it too now. We both stood in the hallway one night, listening as the sound moved through the structure like air filling lungs. The wallpaper in certain spots bulged outward slightly, then flattened again. The house felt less like wood and plaster and more like something alive. Eventually, I opened the basement door we had avoided. The stairs led down to packed dirt instead of concrete. In the center of the basement floor was the same symbol from the attic, carved into the earth itself. The soil around it looked disturbed, as though something had clawed upward from below. The air down there felt suffocating. Lena tried to rationalize everything. Stress. Imagination. But one night she woke screaming, claiming hands had grabbed her ankles from beneath the bed. Deep scratches appeared on the wooden floorboards. That was when I saw doubt leave her completely. Caleb changed after that. One afternoon he stood in the hallway and looked at me with an expression far too calm. When he spoke, his voice sounded layered, two tones overlapping. "It doesn't want you here," he said softly. Then he blinked, and he was himself again, confused and frightened, desperate. I attempted a prayer in the cold room. I held a crucifix and recited everything I could remember. The air grew heavier. My chest tightened as though pressure pushed inward from all sides. The metal crucifix bent slowly in my hand without force. I dropped it in horror. Then Father Dorian returned unexpectedly during a violent storm. He said he had been wrong to leave us. This time, he stepped fully inside. As he began praying loudly in the hallway, the house reacted. Doors slammed. Windows cracked. The walls trembled. A shadow peeled itself from the upper wall, tall and distorted, stretching toward the ceiling. It had no features except a wide, unnatural grin. Father Dorian shouted for us to leave. He pressed his crucifix against the floorboards where the symbol lay beneath. The house shook violently. The shadow wrapped around him like smoke. He continued praying even as the air seemed to crush inward around him. We barely made it outside before flames erupted from the attic windows. The fire burned unnaturally fast, consuming the structure from within. The flames glowed blue at their core. The shadow twisted within the blaze, shrinking as the roof collapsed inward. By sunrise, nothing remained but charred beams and ash. No trace of Father Dorian's body was found. Only his crucifix remained, fused into blackened earth where the symbol had been. For weeks afterward, things were quiet. Caleb stopped speaking of the quiet man. Lena slowly began sleeping again. We moved into a small apartment across town, trying to convince ourselves it was over. But sometimes, late at night, there is a single knock at the door. Last night, I opened it. No one was there. Only a small charred fragment of wood resting on the welcome mat, carved with the same twisted symbol. Beneath it, written faintly in ash, were the words, "A house does not need walls." And for the first time since the fire, I understood. It was never the structure. It was the land. And it knows where we are.